Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko and you're watching my podcast. Today I talk to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. Hi George, how are you? How are you today?
Doing well, doing well. It's interesting as we get ready for election season, a lot fewer people are paying attention to Ukraine. So I feel like the news cycle and Ukraine attention has sort of dropped off, and it'll probably continue to be lower as we head into these next 4 months before November. But doing well, doing well.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. I've been just at the European summit with President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. That was quite exciting. So I'm working on the story about that. So what's the situation on the front line in Ukraine at the moment, and who's got the initiative at the battlefield?
Sure. So at present, the Russians have the initiative. They've had the initiative since October 2023 at the end of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And really what that means is the Russians, they have a lot of luxuries. They have the ability to dictate the tempo of battle, the timing of when to conduct offensives, and the place of when to be able to conduct offensives. And this is actually really important because all of these factors, when the Russians have the initiative, it helps the Russians conduct their desired campaign design. Currently, the Russian campaign design is been deliberately orchestrated to fix Ukrainian forces around the theater, right? There's a 600-kilometer long front line, that runs from Kherson all the way up to Kharkiv, but there's also the international border with Sumy and Chernihiv, and then there's, of course, the border with Belarus. The Russians want to fix as many Ukrainian brigades along this extremely long line in order to facilitate breakthroughs. And also, they want to make sure that this American aid that's being sent to Ukraine, and not just American, European, Czech, et cetera, that ammunition and those supplies, they don't make it to the key priority, the Russians' priority theater where they're trying to do their attacks. They spread it thin and make the Ukrainians ineffective. The Russian priority area of operations for this year, in our assessment, is Donetsk Oblast.
Is Ukraine losing at the moment?
I would say right now, yes, Ukraine is losing. Right, the Ukrainians, they're not retaking significant territory. There's no operationally significant counteroffensive sort of in the immediate future that we see. We're not seeing the Western states fundamentally reapproach the way that we would argue is necessary to ensure that the Ukrainians actually are successful. The key determinant really here is are the Ukrainians going to get the weapons they need? The Ukrainians can be successful, but that entirely depends on what does Washington and London and Brussels and Paris and Berlin do. The Ukrainians have taken tremendous steps in fixing and addressing their own force generation and mobilization issues. All the recent reports indicate that Ukrainian force generation is actually going pretty well. The generation of the new mobilized men is working, and the Ukrainians are on track to form what they plan to do is create 14 new brigades, in addition to reconstituting and restaffing all the existing brigades that are, of course, degraded. But here's the problem. The Ukrainians actually aren't receiving enough weapons and material and tanks and armored personnel carriers to effectively equip 14 brigades. I think the current thinking is that the American supplemental aid that we passed in April, that should equip roughly 4 or so brigades. And then I believe the aid coming from the European Union and that which the Ukrainians can manufacture themselves in Ukraine, that should equip about another 4 or so brigades, which means that we're looking at about roughly, give or take, another 6 or so brigades that aren't going to be receiving enough tanks, armored personnel carriers, and such and thus. And so really what we're looking at here is how Western slow deliveries, insufficient quantities of deliveries, and giving the Russians a lot of benefits, namely in the form of us allowing the Russians to have a sanctuary, a safe space from which they can conduct their offensives into Ukraine. That is really hampering the Ukrainians' ability for success. Now, that said, I know I just said a lot of very pessimistic things, but I do remain optimistic. I do think that the Ukrainians can restore maneuver to the battlefield. I do think there's a lot of military learning that's happening right now, particularly with the interplay of how drones are completely rewriting the rules of how we understand land warfare. And I do think that the Ukrainians can conduct operationally significant counteroffensive operations that do liberate large swaths of Ukraine, like how we saw the Kharkiv counteroffensive back in late 2022, the Kherson counteroffensive, also in late 2022. Right. I think we should start thinking about the planning assumptions and the requirements to achieve those effects again. I don't buy the argument that that's unreplicatable. It's impossible. The Russians dug a whole bunch of lines. Look at the Sorovikin line, right? Like, we need to start thinking about what is necessary to breach and destroy those positions.
Can we talk through the steps which can be the game changer with the situation on the battlefield?
I don't like to use the term game changer because there is no single decisive factor, right? There are no wonder weapons. There are no tactics. There are no singular things that are the silver bullet that change the game. But what can change the game is the confluence of a lot of tiny different things coming together to fundamentally help change the dynamics of the war and help the Ukrainians restore maneuver to the battlefield. I think as we're thinking about the future of warfare and the future nature of warfare that we see, there's a lot of policies and a lot of challenges that we have to overcome to change the rules of the game and help the Ukrainians win. The most and clear and easiest low-hanging fruit that I see is eliminating Russia's sanctuary, right? We need to allow the Ukrainians to fire ATACMS anywhere into Russia, the Russian Federation, where they can, to destroy legitimate military targets. And the reason why is because, look, there's command posts, there are staging areas, there are huge ammunition and fuel depots. These are sort of like the Tesco's and the Costco giant logistics centers that the Russians have optimized in the rear to push as much material and manpower into Ukraine. Yes, we very slightly, the Biden administration very conservatively changed the rules of engagement. We can use HIMARS in a very small area near Kharkiv, but that's not enough to disrupt Russian operations at scale. If we do allow the Ukrainians to strike with ATACMS into Russia, that's going to impose dilemmas on the Russian command. Suddenly, the Russian command is going to start to have to make difficult decisions, like, do we or do we not redeploy some of our important assets, logistics assets, command posts further away from the front, deeper into the rear, out of range? That will degrade all Russian forces beyond that point and degrade Russia's fighting edge within Ukraine. It also forces the Russian command to ask themselves, do we or do we not redeploy our limited protection assets? By those, I mean air defense systems like S-300, S-400 systems, and Russia's high-end electronic warfare defense systems like Ola, Zhitil, and so on and so forth, right? Currently, we give the Russians the luxury where they don't have to protect their deep rear. That allows the Russians to be able to deploy these limited protection assets, air defense and electronic warfare systems, in the frontmost areas of the theater in Ukraine, where they're in contact with Ukrainian systems and Ukrainian forces. But if we open up this huge rear, right, the Russians then might have to redeploy some of these things away from the front to the rear, which will, I hope, weaken their defensive capabilities in the front. And this is really important, right? Because we have Ukrainian F-16s that are going to be entering the theater of operations this year. We want to remove as many of those Russian air defense assets out of the theater as quickly as possible. Russian electronic warfare is a significant challenge for American provided weapons. They've gotten a lot better at jamming GPS, degrading the effectiveness of HIMARS and ATACMS within Ukraine. So if we can get those systems out of Ukraine, that's going to be better. So, and that's just a stroke of a pen for decision makers of allowing what kind of strikes the Ukrainians can conduct within Russia with existing systems already in the country. That, I think, will have a substantial ability to disrupt Russian operations. Number one. Oh, go ahead. I have other thoughts, but go ahead.
What are the weaknesses of Russia on the battlefield? Because we understand Ukraine is lack of manpower, lack of ammunition, and all the necessary decisions which come in from the Western partners, they're pretty much delayed. So, but I'm sure there are weaknesses Russia has. Which one?
Yeah, well, the Russians, they really are weak at everything. They have one strength, and it's mass, right? mass is the one strength that the Russians have, and very large historical supplies of Cold War and Soviet Union era weapons. But beyond that, they don't have a lot of things going well for them. Let's talk about, for example, the Russian warfighting capability. What we've seen so far is the Russians have not actually become more capable at conducting ground offensives over time. They've actually become worse. They used to be using battalions as their main sort of unit for maneuver for offensive operations. That was in 2022. Now in 2024, we rarely see battalion level attacks. We mostly see smaller scale attacks at, the company, less frequently at the company, usually at the platoon level, usually even at the squad level. So we see these poorly trained, poorly equipped individual groups of soldiers, usually, 10 to 30 guys at max, in a very suicidal way, try to fight for some small territorial gains, advancing tens of meters at a time. And they get those gains for sure. They accumulate over time. It's incremental, but at tremendous human cost. And what's interesting is that the Russian strategy at this time, they appear to be fine with that. They don't want to return to the high operational art. They don't want to, return to the great traditions of the Soviet and Russian military of thinking about campaign design, of thinking of multiple successive efforts, right, of rapidly conducting major operational pushes. And they don't seem to be trying to address that. Putin gave a speech to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum last month in which he stated that it's basically okay that we're doing these very sloppy, very unprofessional, small-scale attacks, because Putin thinks that as long as we guarantee that the West, stops supporting Ukraine, it doesn't matter. We're going to still win through this attritional warfare. So, other than just the Russians have a lot of people, they're really not doing that well. I'd also note for you that it's becoming harder for the Russians to find people. There's this very interesting market dynamic at play. If you go look at the Russian recruiting advertisements to go find volunteers for the so-called Russian crypto or shadow mobilization campaign, you go track the records of the sign-on bonuses over time. It used to be a couple thousand rubles, then it was tens of thousands of rubles, and now it's like even more. And it's interesting because as the Russians continue to tap their population for this crypto mobilization, the price for the sign-on bonuses and the service fees and all these things, they're increasing. So there's sort of this supply and demand that's changing, and you can see how the price is raising. And it's raising at what looks to be an unsustainable rate in the long term, 2 to 3 years. Like, they're not going to be able to sustain this for 5 years or beyond, in my opinion. The other thing that the Russians have going for them, their large Soviet stockpile, that's also a finite resource, and it is decreasing. There's been some great open source analyses looking at satellite imagery of open air Russian storage areas where they have tanks and BTRs and armored personnel carriers, right? And from that which we can observe from these spaceborne sensors, the Russians are pulling a tremendous number of these things from long-term storage. And all the estimates currently assess that the Russians are on track to basically run out of all their Soviet era armor within 2 to 3 years, right? So it's not going great for the Russians, and we do have still an opportunity here to have the Ukrainians emerge victorious if we sustain them properly throughout the next couple of years.
Do you think that's the reason why Putin started having these peace talk initiations? Or it was just rhetorics? Because he knows his time running out.
I have a slightly different take. So Putin, in our assessment, is trying to achieve an operational pause for the war. Because, like I said, the Russians had the initiative, and there's a tremendous amount of benefits that come with having the initiative, and that it doesn't allow the Ukrainians to actually be the ones that dictate the pace of battle, that impose dilemmas on the Russian command, that force the Russians to make difficult decisions, right? The Russians can resume this and have a lot of benefits if they achieve an operational pause. And so, and we can talk about what those benefits are. But Putin wants to seduce the Western states. He wants to seduce pliable Western leaders who want to normalize relations, who want to end the war, who want to resume business as normal, right? And what Putin gets out of that is a break to pull out his military that is currently decisively engaged in battle in Ukraine. It's very difficult to pull yourself out of combat when you're currently fighting at the front line. It will allow the Russians to restock, re-equip, rearm their military. And then it will enable Putin to be able to, in a much more sustained and intelligent way, resume the conquest of Ukraine at a place and time of Putin's choosing, right? And so, for example, let's say Putin succeeds in this endeavor. He manages to trick us into accepting negotiations and a ceasefire. And okay, let's say the current lines, like Russia currently occupies 20% of Ukraine. Let's say those current lines become sort of the new, let's call those Minsk 3. That's the Minsk 3 boundaries, right? That will allow the Russians to be able to fortify all this territory to be a giant launch pad for its renewed invasion of Ukraine, potentially in a couple of years or sooner, the same way that the Russians used 8% of occupied Ukraine in 2014, that they got in 2014, Crimea, and what was then the DNR and LNR in the East, for their big-scale invasion in 2022. I'd also note that, look, the Russian war industry, they're fully mobilized. The factories are working, 3 shifts a day. The Russians recruit between 25 to 30,000 men per month. They will use this pause to be able to rebuild, reconstitute, and become even more effective at mass. They'll be able to unplug their units from the front line, reconstitute, regroup them, and then teach lessons learned. Teach the officers, teach the cadre lessons learned from Ukraine, how to fight more effectively. And then there's the other side that happens with the Ukrainians. As soon as there's a ceasefire, or there's going to be a political crisis in Kyiv immediately, because political discontent about not being victorious in the war notwithstanding, there's going to be incredible pressure on Zelensky to demobilize the men. All of the Ukrainians that are currently fighting, they're immediately going to ask for demobilization. Zelensky's going to be in no position to deny demobilization of the men. And so what we'll see is Ukrainian military readiness decrease. American and European levels of military support for Ukraine also in turn decrease. Russian readiness increasing while they fortify the 20% of occupied Ukraine to become a giant series of forward operating bases to then invade Ukraine in the future. So Putin really wants to trick us into this negotiations thing, but we really need to avoid it, because Putin's objective is, by hook or by crook, long-term, seize all of Ukraine.
About military aid that's been already sent to Ukraine. Yesterday I was talking to the guys from the front line. They are on the Zaporizhia direction at the moment. And I mentioned that we are going to have conversations. So I asked them, what would you ask? And sort of like what we could discuss, would be interested. And they are not with Air Force. They are from the other division of the armed forces of Ukraine. But the question was, how many F-16 does Ukraine need to get initiative back in Ukrainian hands?
That's a great question. So it's not about quantity; it's about effects. I would expect we would want to have at least one squadron. You're probably going to need more squadron of F-16s. But look, if you have F-16s, like having F-16s is not going to automatically give you back the initiative. If we allow the Russians, for example, to have a giant secure staging area in Rostov-on-Don, Krasnodar Krai, like you should actually draw out the map. The range of a Russian S-400 system is 400 kilometers. Go draw a line from Rostov-on-Don, where we do not allow the Ukrainians to fire ATACMS, and draw out 400 kilometers and look and see how much airspace that system can cover in a notional way. The Russians can deny the F-16s getting, I think, close to where they matter, unless the pilots fly at a very low area, right? So this is actually, I think, not sort of the appropriate question to ask. It's going to be a good, positive thing, but to get back the initiatives, the Ukrainians are going to need F-16s. They're going to need less strict rules of engagement to allow the Ukrainians to hit the Russians in their weak underbelly in the rear. And then we have to rethink, how do we actually conduct maneuver warfare? I think there's actually a huge conversation to be had here, because what the lessons from the 2023 counteroffensive told us is that all of our ideas for how to conduct a penetration of a prepared enemy position in depth are invalidated. The Russians have this, and all your military readers, especially those who've been to academy, will be familiar with the Soviet concept of the reconnaissance strike complex. The Russians have what we call a tactical reconnaissance strike complex. This is a system that incorporates artillery and direct fire, aircraft with observation from drones, including drones that are capable of doing strikes, like FPV drones and indirect fire drones. Previous doctrine used to think, here's how you breach an enemy defense. You approach the enemy defense, maybe you can achieve some operational surprise. You will use indirect fire and air support and stuff to suppress the enemy defensive lines. You bring your engineering assets in front, your mine rollers, your plows, the things to be able to get through the trenches and get through the dragon's teeth and stuff and get to the minefields. And then you have your mechanized armor breach and exploitation force. Then the tanks and stuff, once they have a clear path to get through the mines and the obstacles, they then go through as a decisive breakthrough point. They widen the breach, and then all your follow-on forces in the exploitation echelon move forward, right? That's the old concept. That doesn't work anymore, because you're never going to achieve operational surprise, because you're constantly going to be viewed by Russian Lancet and other kinds of reconnaissance drones, even cheap DJI drones from China and stuff. So you're going to be seen the whole time. They're immediately going to start calling in fire on you as soon as they observe you, before you even commence with your movement. Once you get into your exploitation and breach phase, they're going to send a whole bunch of FPV drones upon you to destroy you. And they'll be able to decisively defeat you before you even approach your first objective, which is unfortunately the lesson we learned from the 2023 counteroffensive. So now what we're realizing is that the initiative is a lot less like one side has it, one side doesn't. It's now like, who can create windows of opportunity? Who can seize the initiative for a very short period by denying and destroying the Russian tactical reconnaissance strike complex? I would argue that we need to think about capabilities, electronic warfare, jamming, directed energy, and suppressing systems that will create temporary effects, take out Russian artillery, remove the ability for the Russians to use their drones, create this period where you can actually operate and do your breach. But then you have to be prepared that it's not going to be a sustained period. You have to then bunker down, survive until because the enemy is going to get their drones back up. And then you're going to have to do the cycle again. Use electronic warfare, deny their ability to use drones, counter-barricade fires to keep their artillery systems suppressed, and then continue to leapfrog through. This is a very theoretical and academic way that we're thinking about the future evolution of land warfare, and so it's difficult to say, because what we're seeing now is sort of a paradigm shift, like how in World War I, some European armies still believed in having cavalry on horses, because that's what they all knew from the wars of the 19th century. And so you had cavalry charges, with the last great cavalry charges with men on horseback going up against trenches with machine guns and early tanks and that sort of thing. And then everyone realized, oh wow, our entire paradigm for how to do maneuver warfare with horses and cavalry, like, that doesn't work anymore. And so we created new ways of waging war. We are at like the similar junction in, I think, land warfare now.
How about Western partners? We know that they sent to Ukraine old ammunition, like 40, 30-year-old missiles and all of that. So why don't they send everything they have in the warehouses? Because they are charged to storage all of that and sent to Ukraine, because it's expired, to be soon expired. Why they act differently?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. Part of the reason is it's easier to approve within the Congress, and it's easier to give away military assistance for things that are not going to have a lot of utility for us, or cheap things, old things, right? They still can be effective and useful. So we can achieve a lot of positive effects with those systems. So it's an easier political sell to get them to the Ukrainians, number one. Number two, and this is really the sad reality, the American and in general Western defense industrial base has atrophied tremendously since the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. We used to have many factories in the United States that would produce 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, for example. We currently have, as of last year, we have a grand total of 2 factories that make that ammunition. We just opened a third in Texas with the support of Turkey. Our ability to produce a variety of ammunition, HIMARS ammunition, Javelin, Stinger, Patriot interceptors, right? A lot of these factories and the skilled labor that goes into making them since the end of the 1980s, they decreased substantially because the United States, for the last 30 years, we were fighting the global war on terror. We were fighting adversaries, irregular forces, terrorist insurgents who didn't have air forces, who didn't have blue water navies, who didn't conduct large-scale combat operations, right? So the American defense industrial base footprint changed drastically. And what we've discovered now is that given the very limited amount of things that we can produce, if we give all the new stuff to Ukraine, then we decrease America's readiness for our other defense commitments, for example, what we have in the Pacific with Taiwan and China, and also for other emergency contingencies. I would argue that what Ukraine has showed us is that America is really in a extremely vulnerable position. We are not prepared to deter or defeat major land wars. U.S. doctrine supposes that we should be ready to wage a war in Europe and a war in the Pacific at any given time and be successful in both. That comes from World War II. But we're not there yet. We're not there anymore, rather. So what really the U.S. has to do is we need to fundamentally and substantially increase our readiness. And that means that we need to put forward more government tenders. We need to rebuild our defense industrial base. We need to open new factories. We need to train and retrain skilled workers to produce Javelin ammunition and Patriot interceptors and ATACMS missiles and HIMARS and all this stuff, because it's really a lost skill, it's lost labor that we lost after the end of the 90s.
But are the warehouses empty already, or there's still some old missiles and old artillery and everything else?
It depends on the system. I think that there's no good reason we haven't given Ukraine more Abrams main battle tanks. The Ukrainian 47th Brigade that's operating around the Avdiivka area now. We gave them, this is all the tanks that America has given Ukraine. We've given them 1 battalion's worth of Abrams tanks. We gave them a grand total of 31 tanks. Meanwhile, out in the desert in the United States at our storage, we have, thousands of Abrams tanks that are not doing anything. They're just sitting there sort of waiting for the theoretical big war that the United States would need them in. But I think a lot of policymakers don't realize that the Ukrainians are fighting this war on the behalf of NATO's collective defense. Now they are destroying so much of Russia's capability. Like, this is the war that these weapons, in theory, were developed for, and we should give more of them. When it comes to 155 ammunition, that's different. We've given a tremendous amount of 155 ammunition, and there's a global shortage of that, and everyone's racing to increase production. So it varies on system to system. I don't have insight into, how many ATACMS missiles we have left, how many HIMARS missiles we have left. Those are, ATACMS in particular, fairly high-end assets of which we have a very limited quantity. So it's difficult to give them at scale. But I would argue we need to massively increase production so we can give them at scale, because what we see is that is the requirement for success in the Ukrainian battlefield.
Our Russians behave differently on different parts of the front line. You mentioned earlier that Donetsk region is their priority. Do they have sort of like different type of behavior near Sumy or, for example, near Chernihiv, which is north part of Ukraine? Can you actually see these priorities?
Yeah, we can see priority by weight of effort, by frequency of attacks, where are the high-end assets, where are the Russians conducting rotations, all that sort of thing. All of these different observable factors weigh into our assessment for the priority theater. Yes, priority area of operations within the theater. Yes, we can see these differences. So if we talk about, for example, the border area near Bryansk and Kursk Oblast, like you said, near Chernihiv and Sumy, we don't see large-scale combat operations across the border. We see sporadic raids into border villages. We see mortar attacks and shelling, usually not at extremely high sustained rates of fire, right? So that's clearly not a priority area of operations. We can talk about what we see in the south, in Zaporizhia, near, for example, Orykhov, Verbove, Robotene, right? We see a different type of Russian tactical positional warfare there to try to retake the territory the Ukrainians got with their counteroffensive last year. We can talk about the kinds of operations we see in Kherson and by the Dnipro River Delta, right on those islands there near Krimky. Very interesting things happening there, but also clearly not the priority area of operations. The Russians, for example, recently redeployed some units that were operating in the Kherson direction out of Kherson and actually sent them to Kharkiv to go support the operations near Vovchansk. Donetsk is the priority area of operations because that is where the Russians are investing the majority of their forces, the majority of their assets, and they're driving towards operationally significant objectives. There are three tactical areas of prioritization there that we see the Russians going after. Going north to south, those are Chasiv Yar, which leads to, of course, the Ukrainian fortress cities. Konstantinivka is the closest one, but Drushkivka is there, Slavyansk is there, and we know that the Russians want to dismantle those fortress cities as part of the campaign to capture all of Donetsk, which the Russians have illegally declared as annexed. Second tactical area of concentration is Toretsk. Toretsk is interesting. If the Russians succeed in seizing Toretsk, they can have a new angle of attack to go against Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka from the south to attack the southern flank, or they can use it to keep going west or southwest in a different direction. The third area is the Avdiivka area in the direction of Pokrovsk. If you sort of look at a city and population map of Donetsk Oblast, Pokrovsk is the last sort of the closest operationally significant large fortress city in that sort of south central part of the front line. And the Russians have a assessed operational objective to seize Pokrovsk, to sever the supply line on the highway that runs in that direction there in order to further their advance in Donetsk Oblast. So that is the priority. The Russians are exploring opportunities there. And these operations that we see across the border in Sumy and Chernihiv, the operation that the Russians began on May 10 in Kharkiv, those are all essentially supporting efforts designed to pull Ukrainian forces away. And they were somewhat successful in that, right? I believe it was the Ukrainian Holodny Yar brigade, I believe the 92nd Brigade, they were operating over by Chasiv Yar at the beginning of this year. They redeployed to the Kharkiv direction to go defend near Vovchansk when the Russians began that effort. So that's another brigade that's not defending the Chasiv Yar direction because they were forced to go move up to Kharkiv. So that's the point.
You mentioned Pokrovsk last summer. I was in Pokrovsk, and it's very surreal place. It's the furthest. It's basically the end of civilization. Train doesn't go anywhere, and the passengers. It's mainly either servicemen or wives who come in to see them. So it's something unimaginable and not comparable. And you mentioned Kharkiv offensive. Some of my friends from intelligence, they were sent to Kharkiv to hold it. And I know you were expecting counteroffensive a bit later, but they started earlier. Why do you think they decided to advance the area earlier than sort of all the factors pointed out at it?
Yeah. So all the intelligence at the time, I'll just repeat some of this for the viewers for context. All the indicators at the time suggested that the Russians wanted to achieve an operational group of about 60 to 100,000 people for their campaign in Kharkiv. And the Russians were gathering guys in Belgorod for that operation. And it seemed like they would need until at least late May, early June to get close to that target number, or closer to the target number. The Russians, however, began the operation about a month earlier than we expected on May 10. And they had a much smaller operational force than what we thought they wanted to achieve. They only had between about, I want to say it was like about 30,000 forces. So they only got like about half of what they were trying to get for that operation. It's important to look at the time relationships between key events for what's happening in the world. We get the American aid passed in the Congress in April. And then we see the Russians expedite their efforts to conduct the Kharkiv operation on a faster timeline. It's our assessment that the Russians expedited the timeline in order to divert as much of that, what would then be incoming American aid that got approved in April, prevent it from going to Donetsk, prevent it from going to the priority efforts, prevent it from re-equipping and re-staffing Ukrainian units that really badly need it, and get that to go to Kharkiv as soon as possible to divert it, to further weaken the Ukrainian defense around Donetsk and improve the Russian chances of having a breakthrough near Avdiivka or near Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka. And I'd note for you that in mid-April, the Russians actually did have some tactical breakthroughs near Avdiivka, right? It was Avdiivka fell around then, and then there were the series of villages to the west of Avdiivka, Berdichi, and so on and so forth that the Russians captured relatively quickly for them. And so the Russians wanted to continue that momentum. And so now with this large quantity of American aid on the way, I think Gerasimov, either Gerasimov or Putin, I don't know who, they made a decision to commence with the Kharkiv operation a few weeks earlier than planned because they needed to deny that aid from reaching Donetsk Oblast.
About F-16, I was talking recently to one of the pilots who was trained in the US, and so we exchanged different thoughts. And he shared with me that the main challenge for them was the time pressure, because there's a huge amount of knowledge and skills they need to master in a very short period of time. For some people, there was the language barrier, but not for the guy I was talking to. So what's your take on this training? And what do you expect from this first? We know that it's not a big group of pilots have been trained, but what do you expect? How it's gonna? Are we going to feel their influence on the war situation?
Not in the short term, because right now it's clear that there's a bottleneck on trainers and the training capacity for the pilots. We actually have this dilemma now where there's more F-16s being pledged from various different countries than we have Ukrainian pilots for them. And we're getting F-16 pledges a lot more rapidly than we can actually train Ukrainian F-16 pilots. And this is sort of emblematic of a lot of the problems that Western aid for Ukraine have faced over the last 2.5 years, right? The policy planners persistently failed to take into account the key time-space relationships between when a political decision to give certain kind of aid is made, the implied and required logistical time to actually get that system operational in the hands of the Ukrainians, and then when that effect was needed. So what happens is we usually debate for a long time. Like in effect, a capability is needed like when it's needed. The Ukrainians say, hey, we need this now. We then spend a long time, usually months, debating should we or should we not do it. And then we agree, okay, we'll do it. And then there's a long logistical and training and setup and sending it period that then that is necessary. And then by the time that the Ukrainians actually get the capability, it's so far away from when they initially needed it. And so I really wish, and I try to emphasize this in all my discussion with policymakers, which is, look, if we're going to make the right decisions at the end of the day, but just really late, we really need to do the best that we can to expedite the process so that this time gap period from when the need is observed and when the capability gap is filled, we have to try to shrink that as much as possible. The pilot training gap is one of those. But to be fair, at least to the Americans, we have the Americans for our own Air Force, we have a pilot training gap. It's very difficult to be able to train even our own pilots. And that's a long-term problem that we have ourselves. But it will make a difference. I think what I'm hopeful for is if we do make the right combination of decisions, if we send the Ukrainians a squadron or 2 or 3 worth of F-16s, if we train enough pilots to be able to fly that effectively, if we use long-range strikes, if we use ATACMS and Storm Shadow to deny Russian S-400 deployments anywhere within the range of close to Ukraine, that actually does give the Ukrainian pilots some decent operational range to be able to, one, better defend Ukrainian airspace from missile and drone threats. And then number 2, this is my optimistic pitch, over time, we can work towards a concept of operations where Ukrainian F-16 pilots can actually engage in air-to-ground support operations in support of a combined arms offensive. But that is predicated on the assumption that we deny Russian air defense assets anywhere close to the Ukrainian theater, which implies that we allow the Ukrainians to strike pretty deep into the Russian territory. I hope we make that decision.
Well, fingers crossed. While Ukrainians painfully were waiting for the vote in the US, Russians had this window of opportunity. Do you think they used it to the full extent, or they actually missed bits and it could be used better?
That's a great question. There were 2 choices for the Russians here. They could have done what they did, which was a series of grinding, protracted offensive operations, very high operational tempo, high level of cost, not particularly effective, but you eke out these small tactical gains. The other thing the Russians could have done is spent a little bit more effort reconstituting their forces and tried to conduct a larger, better planned, better prepared, better supplied offensive operation in a couple different areas. The last time the Russians really did that was October 2023 for the renewed offensive for Avdiivka, which ended around February. There are benefits that the Russians get beyond the battlefield benefits of conducting the first kind of warfare, this protracted, militarily sloppy, relatively incompetent sort of lumbering offensive where they lose a lot of guys for very small territorial gains. That reinforces, I think, an important Russian information operation that Putin is aggressively and constantly waging against the West, which is Russia is the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation Army is the Red Army. Russia has infinite men. They have infinite resources. And no matter what they do, they're going to be able to slowly capture and conquer all of Ukraine. And we know that these things are not true. Gerasimov is not Zhukov, and Putin is not Stalin, and the Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union, and the Russian army is not the Red Army. We know that the Russians actually can be defeated, that they do have they have limited resources, and we do know that the Ukrainians can be successful when they're supplied correctly. But Putin has these narratives about what is Russia, and what are these great myths, a lot of them based off of pseudo-historical myths about World War II. And Putin tries to reinforce this for all of the Westerners who are supporting Ukraine. And when Putin conducts 6 months worth of, sloppy, ineffective, highly attritional warfare, but the lines on the map get better for the Russians, that reinforces this narrative that sort of lives in Westerners' minds about, oh man, we really can't beat the Russians. That it's like an infinite pool. They have, you wake up the bear, you wake up Mother Russia, we can never defeat them. So beyond, there's a discussion here to be had about what would be better militarily. I would argue that would be better militarily is conduct a competent offensive operation save your guys, rebuild an operationally offensive group, be more capable, be more deliberate with the planning. But that's just a military conversation. You bring in the political and psychological manipulation perspective. And by the way, we assess the only way the Russians win this war is they successfully psychologically manipulate us into abandoning Ukraine. If we lean into supporting the Ukrainians, the Russians lose. If you take into that account at Putin's theory of victory, which is we're going to convince the West to abandon Ukraine over time, then that approach actually makes a lot of sense.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation the successful counteroffensive in Kharkiv region and in Kherson. One of the episodes on the podcast devoted to Kharkiv, and I know what sort of publicly and behind the scenes was happening with planning, with how they did and how they succeeded. But from your perspective, what was the main push and sort of, we mentioned that it's not one factor, it's combination of many. But with this counteroffensive, was it in time and successful military aid from the Western partners, or there were some other factors which were the main in those operations?
Yeah, there's a lot of undergirding similar commonalities between those two counteroffensive operations. One of them was degraded and attrited state of the Russian military. In particular, this was much more the case for the Kharkiv counteroffensive. The 3rd Army Corps was operating there, and the remnants of the 1st Guard Tanks Army that was operating in that sort of large part of Kharkiv Oblast that the Ukrainians rapidly liberated. That was a very rotten sort of, the trunk of that tree was very rotten on the core. They were not supplied well. They were attrited very badly. The theater command was not paying them sufficient attention. And so when the Ukrainians pushed on it with 4 brigades relatively lightly, it sort of just collapsed like a house of cards. And the Ukrainians earned that through strikes. They earned that through attrition. They also got it in part for free because the Russian, theater command was stretched too thin, and they did not adequately reinforce or sustain those forces. That's what enabled the Ukrainians in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And it tells us that when we do target the rear, when we do attrit and degrade forces, when we do exploit an exhausted, culminated adversary who's not able to defend himself effectively, you can indeed achieve operationally significant movement. The Russians did not have extensive field fortifications there. They didn't have the Surovikin line there at the time, but I don't think it would have mattered. I think if you pushed up against a force that is fundamentally exhausted, not well sustained, that is rotten at the core, having a defensive lines to sink into, that will help them, but it's not going to decisively ensure they cannot defend themselves. For the Kherson counteroffensive, this is, I think, is a strong case example where it was indeed a weapon systems that decisively made a difference. Part of it is because of the unique geography of Kherson, right? You had the Dnieper River, you had a grand total of 3 bridges, you had the Antonovsky Bridge, the hydroelectric plant bridge, and then a railroad bridge. Very few places to get in and out effectively across the river. And the Ukrainians very judiciously used the HIMARS to deny the bridges for the Russians to be able to extract. And so what we got was a very difficult Russian decision to voluntarily leave the right bank of Kherson without a fight, without any kind of urban combat for Kherson city, simply because the Ukrainians were conducting a protracted series of offensive operations from the north, the crossing near Snegurivka and the battles near Davydibryd and all that stuff, pushing the Russians closer. The Russians knowing that the bridges are not going to be able to use. And so I believe it was General Surovikin made a very difficult but necessary decision that we're going to leave and not not put at risk several tens of thousands of Russian troops being caught between the Ukrainians and a river we can't cross. Without the HIMARS system, without that capability to deny the use of the bridge and exploit the geography of the Dnieper River, I don't think the Russians would have ever left that position, because it was a very strong position for them to have. And so I think analysts going to be difficult to replicate something that's a sort of the perfect combination of factors, the geography, the choke points with the bridges, the river, and other parts of the theater. But these exist on smaller scales, right? There is interesting micro-terrain in Ukraine. There is interest. If you study the Surovikin line in depth and you see actually some of the places where it's weaker, where it's stronger, there actually are these sorts of opportunities for exploitation. And to look at the entire 600-mile long front line and say, oh, the Russians dug trenches there, we can't cross it. Like that's such a broad generalization that really ignores a lot of the detail when you pick up the magnifying glass and sort of look at it in a more deliberate way.
What do you think about attacks by Ukrainian SBU and defense intelligence using the sea drones, and those explosions was happening in Crimea? Does it look for you, it's more like, lifting up the spirits of Ukrainian side, or it's actually little steps for liberating Crimea? What's your take?
I think it's the latter. It does set conditions for important effects that will be necessary for the eventual liberation of Crimea. I'm putting no timeline on that campaign. It's going to be a long time coming, assuming we even continue to support Ukraine through their operations. I hope we do. But with the drone strike campaigns, I mean, there's two parts. There's the drone strike campaign with the Sea Baby drones, and then there's also the missile strike campaign and the air drone campaign as well. Those are all part of the larger undertaking to deny Crimea, right? Destroy the Russian military presence in Crimea. Those have very important operational effects. The Ukrainians have effectively denied the Russian Black Sea fleet's ability to operate in the western part of the Black Sea. The Russians for a long time, as you recall, with the grain deal drama with Turkey and all of that, they for a long time were threatening to put a naval blockade to deny Ukraine's ability to ship important goods like grain and other materials to and from Ukraine through Odessa. That is absolutely critical for the world, absolutely critical for Ukraine's economy. And so the Ukrainians have successfully denied and disrupted the Russians' ability to operate surface vessels in the Black Sea fleet, in the western part of the Black Sea. So that's very important for the grain corridor, among other things. The other strikes that we see against Russian objects in Crimea have also, we know, forced the Russians, or at least convinced them that they need to redeploy significant military assets out of the peninsula and send them elsewhere. Do they go to, occupied Georgia and Abkhazia, or do they go to the different port in Novorossiysk or elsewhere, right? They are indeed sending ships there. They are indeed taking out air defense assets from Crimea. These are important effects because when those assets leave Crimea, it weakens the entire Russian position in southern Ukraine. Because as you know, and empires of history have always seen Crimea as whoever controls Crimea controls the Black Sea. And Crimea, as a peninsula geographically, it's an extremely strong position to be able to wage war into Zaporizhia, into Kherson. It was the key staging. I mean, there's a reason why the most successful Russian axis of advance on February 24, 2022 was southern Ukraine out of Crimea. Part of it was the Ukrainians didn't defend themselves well there, but another part is it's a very advantageous place for defense and attack. So if we can create those long-term effects, hollow out the Russian position there, make it vulnerable, deny Russian air defense assets being there, degrade the sea fleet there, these all create important effects that will be necessary for campaigns in southern Ukraine in the future. And it also has the good benefit of keeping up Ukrainian morale, which is also important.
Boris Johnson recently visited the candidate for the president, Donald Trump, and they sort of discussed the Johnson peace plan. And also, as we mentioned, Putin, he talks about peace. So what's your take on both peace plans for this war?
I'm not familiar with the Johnson peace plan. I am familiar with the Zelensky's proposed peace plan, the one that they spoke about the summit in Geneva. The Ukrainian peace plan makes a lot of sense. It tries to crystallize an end state of this war in which Ukraine's territorial integrity is not compromised. Ukraine emerges as a territorially whole and sovereign state, as its borders are defined in international law, as the Russian Federation has seen, and what are in the interest of of the United States and of NATO. It makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, you have Putin's desire for a peace plan. And I think like I said, it'll be like Minsk 3. It'll be another attempt for the Russians to lie about their objectives. And frankly, the Russians really don't deserve that level. It's sort of like fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. This would be the third time the Russians would have fooled us, because before it was, oh, we're not in Crimea, we only care about a warm water port in Sevastopol. And then it was, oh, we don't really want to annex the Donetsk and Luhansk and all this stuff. And now Putin's most recent preconditions for any kind of negotiation is, I want to veto on NATO policy. I get to change the NATO charter, close the open door policy. Ukraine cannot join NATO, which, by the way, gives the idea that the Russians can demand that we change the NATO charter for him is ridiculous on principle. Number two, Ukraine cannot be a sovereign state. Ukraine cannot. We get to dictate the terms of the Ukrainian constitution. That is also ridiculous. And then number three, we get 4 oblasts, none of which the Russian actually occupy or control in their entirety. And that will be the point at which and demilitarization. Demilitarization is also still part of his objective. So a Ukraine that is not sovereign, that cannot defend itself, that is not territorially whole. We have a veto over NATO. Like, this is Putin's starting point. And it's very clearly Putin wants Ukraine's total capitulation, to have a weak Ukraine that the Russians can conquer in the future whenever it wants, and a NATO that's not going to do anything. Right. And then Putin, with his manipulation, presents these list of demands as, this can all be over. We can have peace. We can have negotiations. Like, we can go back to the happy world where everything's fine. Like, all we have to do is you just have to take these demands. And he minimizes, he puts it out there just so blatantly, as if it's like a normal request. And a lot of people uncritically just say, well, why aren't we considering Putin's demand? Putin's a reasonable guy. We are the ones that aren't reasonable. Absolutely not. I really hope that we do not allow ourselves to, that's the other issue. There's a framing problem right now in the information space about negotiations. Negotiations and a deal and a ceasefire for the sake of negotiations and a deal and a ceasefire is not a win. It would be a major loss, right? We should not give the Russians a major win for free when we can avoid it. But a lot of people are talking about ceasefires and negotiations and peace like as an intrinsic good. But anything that the Russians get right now through that process would not be a lasting peace. It would be a temporary pause to reopen this war at a future time. So we need to avoid that mental trap.
So what are we going to expect this year on the battlefield?
This year, we will not likely see any Russian major operational breakthroughs. We'll probably continue to see incremental Russian tactical gains, particularly in eastern and southern Ukraine. So I expect the map to get a little bit worse for the Ukrainians, but not that much worse. The Ukrainians are doing a good job, again, with their mobilization. They're building those new units. They're doing a good job of fortifying the lines, digging new trenches, particularly in the south and Zaporizhia and the east. The lines are going to stabilize. Winter is going to be extremely hard for the Ukrainians with the energy destruction campaign that the Russians are waging with their air and missile campaign. And then I hope that we can see the Ukrainians resume offensive operations, probably on a smaller scale, a better scoped, more sustainable, and more achievable scale in early 2025. After the Ukrainians finish forming these new brigades that they're building, and after they equip and train them some more.
I noticed when you were pronouncing the names of the villages and the cities, I noticed your phonetics is very good. Have you been in Ukraine? And if not, have you developed any attachment while studying, analyzing, and updating daily on the war situation?
Yeah, so I've been to Ukraine. The last time I'm overdue for a visit. The last time I was there was in 2018, but I've not gone since then. I'm a Ukrainian American. I have roots to Ukraine. Two of my grandparents on my mother's side are from Ukraine. I still have family there, so I keep in touch with them and I want to go see them again. I speak Ukrainian, not particularly well, but I speak Ukrainian. I'm still studying it. I speak Russian very well, so yeah. I do have feelings and towards Ukraine, but I try not to have that cloud my judgment because at the end of the day, from the strictly realpolitik, sort of Machiavellian American interest perspective, it is in our interest that the Russian invasion is decisively defeated. Because if the Russians win in Ukraine, if Putin achieves what he wants, the reunification of the Russian and Ukrainian people and the restoration of Russia's historical lands, then the Russian border with Europe and NATO is then going to be on Romania and Poland and Hungary and Slovakia. And that kind of Russian long flank is going to require tens of thousands of Americans to redeploy to Europe to have a forward presence to defend NATO's eastern flank in a way that we've not had a forward presence like that since the Cold War. And that's going to make it extremely difficult for us to balance our priorities in Asia and Europe. So we really need to defeat this war.
What part of Ukraine your roots coming from?
They're primarily from Western Ukraine. So my grandfather was born in Zhytomyr Oblast in the 1930s, and then my grandmother, her family is from Ternopil Oblast.
Oh, how lovely. George, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your expertise and your time. It's been endless pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jenny. It's been nice chatting with you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
You too.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for all your comments, likes, shares. I really appreciate, and thank you for finding time to watch this episode. Thank you very much. I'm Jenny Klochko. Thank you for watching.